Well, here we are again in the new year.
Yes, good to
With
see you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. I hope it brings you all the things that you wish it
Yeah,
does.
I hope that too, amazingly. Yeah, thanks.
Well, good luck with that.
Exactly, exactly. And in a way, and what we were just talking about, but just before we, as it were, came live, it's like, what's astrology's role in that at the start of a year? We're looking at what do we want from astrology? And as we were setting up and going through some technical issues, we were talking about Raddy brought up, Mercury's gone direct, but I'm still struggling to switch to the correct mic. And it struck me that, in a way, though, of course, it's important to track retrograde periods and the Mercury retrograde phenomena people can produce very real and profound historical evidence for. This more general idea that just day to day, microphones don't connect, or, flights don't fly or are cancelled when Mercury's going direct. It's a fallacy, isn't it? It happens when it's retrograde, it happens when it's direct. It's not a simple correlation. And straight away, that makes me come into some recent thinking of mine, which is, for me at least, we have to emphasize the art side of astrology. This is an art, not a science. This is not a STEM subject. You and I are not going to walk out here with our study of retrograde cycles, and people are not going to drive cars over bridges, based on what we said and whether that bridge will hold, like an engineer. We're not in that literal concrete world. And I think it's really important because people, understandably, in the suffering of their lives and their confusion and their hopes and dreams for the new year, they want some sense of certainty that their wishes will come true. Your delightful wish for me. And they bring a lot of that to astrology, don't they? They look at that chart, they look at the patterns in the sky, and they want things to go better in their lives, or they want some of the dreams and desires to manifest. And I'm not sure, looking in that way, where you take it very literally and you say, because such and such is coming to a certain point in your chart, that is actually the best way to achieve those goals.
Yeah, I think we just lost a lot of clients here.
Yes. I know. I do wonder sometimes if my general attempt to find the truth isn't actually eroding my own audience. But I sympathize. Don't. It's not a judgment. I'm trying to elucidate compassionately a theme about truth, really, and about agency in one's life. That the key to me is to sense the agency in one's life. There is an inner chart, in a sense, right? The chart is operating in my psyche, like my energy field, my natal chart. And the key is to understand that on some level, to understand, as it were, the pattern or shape or color of my soul through my chart. And then you can see the bigger outer movements, the trends of history, or transits hitting my chart, or progressions or solar arc directions. You can understand them then as windows of opportunity, as times where, as it were, processes that are going on deep within myself meet a portal or doorway or a window where the world is having something to do with those themes, or the world is giving me an opportunity to learn about that deeper process inside myself. So, in a sense, I'm not saying astrology isn't significant or that you couldn't find deeper answers to your life's purpose within it. I just say you can't look literally for those. You have to look poetically, effectively. You have to bring out the art side of the astrology and realize it's speaking somehow more soulfully to something more mysterious in a way within you, but not intangible, mysterious and subtle, but still very real. In fact, possibly more real than day-to-day concerns.
I was just about to say yes, that it's not only like a fairy tale, or it's not only symbolic. It is very symbolic. It's very artsy, as you say, but also very tangible and very realistic. And I think it comes to taking responsibility here. I believe that my moon in Capricorn and yours too agree.
Yes, yes. I know the classic detrimental position, and yet I don't know about you, but certainly as my life has gone on, and the older I get, the more I feel that is a gift of a placement, a blessing to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And in that sense, that's interesting in itself as a technical distinction. The moon, the ruler of Cancer, is seen as weaker in some forms of astrology when it's in the opposite sign, Capricorn, the sign of Saturn. And yet, as I'm sure you well know, when your personal emotional reality, the moon, when your sense of, as it were, a conditioned self, your habits, your routines, when they can accept Saturn, whatever hardship there is on that way. Okay, so the hardship is real. But when you do get to this point of acceptance of Saturn, personal life changes, doesn't it? I would argue that's an initiation. I would argue Saturn's challenge presents us that kind of almost military challenge. Can you get up? Can you do a few laps of the training ground and carry your bag and do these things? Your version in your life. Not that I'm advocating for the military here, but just the soldier aspect of reality. Can you get up and get on with it, as it were? It's tremendously liberating, isn't it? So this very language we use in astrology, detrimental for moon in Capricorn, whatever it is, the moon in a weakened position. We have to realize that once the weakness is addressed, or once the issue of the symbolism of Saturn asking the moon to do push-ups, as it were, psychically, is accepted, it's incredibly liberating. It's an incredible gift. So even the language of astrology, we have to be very careful about, don't we? Because the very things that we perceive as symbolically weaknesses or detriments in astrology might actually have the great hidden strength for people.
It is indeed very important because I think that there are still a lot of leftovers from the old ages where things might mean like you will be beheaded or something. And people read these things nowadays and they're like, oh my God, is somebody going to attack me? Am I going to die? Or things like that. But it's time for us to really renovate the language and be careful about the symbolic meaning of it as well, and be self-aware. I think this is the key to everything, really, because the planets don't affect us. They are a mirror image of us, and it's a different ways of seeing it, but still it's a mirror image. And there are layers in it, but it's the same thing happening to us is happening in the sky.
Well, and that points to the subtle distinction between correlation and causation.
Mm.
Things are happening, as it were, archetypally in resonance with your life and its unfolding is actually a very profoundly different picture than attributing causation to it. And attributing causation might be very dangerous, as well as potentially philosophically inaccurate. It could see you give up your agency. Let's say that Saturn moon example, moon in Capricorn, the trainer comes along and says, do your psychic push-ups, and you don't want to do it. You can just go, well, Saturn's in a terrible position here, moon in Capricorn, Saturn's hurting the moon. It can make you stuck because it's a challenge in life to see the hidden gifts in things. It's all convenient on a podcast like this or some YouTube presentation or talking to Oprah or something to do the spin reveal right at the beginning. Well, it was the toughest time in my life, but then the light shone down and I wrote this amazing book and here I am touring the world or whatever it is. When you're in it, there's zero guarantee it all works out. You don't know it works out when you're in it. That's the challenge. That's the point of being incarnate, isn't it? That you have to live through this. The meaning of life is arguably not a conceptual answer. It's the actual process of living through. That something actually occurs to you because you just have to go through it.
It's and the problem with people that are on, let's say, Oprah's show, and that have gone through some difficulty, and then they have blossomed in a millionaire way, for example, is that they say, "You can all do it the way I did it. If I can do it, you can do it." And I think this is a big problem.
That's a brilliant point. I call that the myth of the self-made person. Yeah. um, that they can't help but see the world through their own heroic narrative. They pulled themselves up from the roughest part of the back streets of the roughest town, and now they are whatever, an investment banker, or a multimillionaire, billionaire philanthropist, or whatever, right? Missing all the unique set of circumstances that led to that, the particular conditions of the time, the people that helped them along the way, or even let's just say they did just do it from sheer talent, that they are like some world-class sports star or something, right? And all respect to them. Like, do I value that kind of sporting excellence? I sure do. I have massive respect for it. At the same time, the idea that everyone's going to be born a potential Tom Brady or Novak Djokovic is just, it's just not possible, is it? I mean, that's literally the nature of that structure, that only certain people will come through. I've been thinking about this a lot because this year I'll be opening a tele-summit for Astrology University at the end of March on the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, and then I'm teaching with Tony Howard of Astrology University in Dublin on the same theme, a longer workshop. And I was thinking just last night and this morning about a certain idea about that, Uranus coming to Jupiter and saying, what are your visions? What's your vision of meaning, of which, let's say, the self-made story is one type vision of meaning, or, the scientific universe, a cold and lonely universe with a little rock, planet Earth, shooting through it at great speed. You have all these stories, or the Christian story, right, which is actually quite complex and multi-layered. Uranus comes to our Jupiter and says, what's your vision of reality? And then Taurus, what impact does that have on your values? And what impact does that have in the practical real world? Because people's ideas and their visions and their ideological concerns has a massive impact on reality. It's not a subtle and abstract sphere. I think people have seen it like that for too long, in a way. Like, get the important literal stuff done, get the food on the table, get the money in the bank, get the bridges built, and then we can go to the theater or listen to some music, like a little extra, and that's why people don't like it when I say things like astrology is an art, not a science. But I'm arguing differently. I'm saying that without the beauty or power of certain music, let's say, without the healing, redemptive vision of music, and the way it soothes people's suffering, all of this is lessened. It's not an extra to go to the symphony, as the perk of having, excuse me, a good job, and having a nice apartment in the city. And now I can go to the symphony. It's like, at its best, the redemptive power of Bach or Miles Davis soothes the human experience, soothes the deepest part of the human experience. So when I say astrology is an art, not a science, I mean that. I mean, like, if you could get over the fact that it's not bridge building, that it's not as literal as engineering, that it can't tell you data in that kind of specific way that science can, in an endlessly repeatable, verifiable by experiment kind of way, then you realize that it might partake of that, redemptive power of the most beautiful art, the kind of cosmic soothing, the sense that we're here for more than just, material gain, or to exert our power and control over reality.
And then there are way too many astrologers working as if they are engineers.
Yes.
Which...
Yeah, your tone says it all. I agree with your tone. You said a lot implicitly there, didn't you? You there was a little kind of, I'm a little bit concerned about that, Mark, in my tone, or, a certain ironic kind of awareness of it. Yeah, I mean, I just out of respect to my community, I'll keep it polite. But yeah, there are an awful lot of people pretending that a complex archetypal poetic form, kind of like a poem or a symphony, by reality to you. That's what your chart is, if you like, some sort of multi-layered artistic statement about you, potentially about you. and they're treating it like they've just been given an instruction manual for operating their dishwasher or their new car. And I don't just think that's off. I personally don't just think that's flawed. I think it's bordering on a kind of madness. I mean, it's a philosophical literalism that's just beyond belief, really.
I find it amazing that they have been working for a very long time and they still stay there, because I started as an engineer, let's say engineer. I started learning astrology and practicing it even more, like a person who wants to know the exact data and wants to know when is happening what. And this is, of course, the need for control and the need to know, because as we saw, especially in the COVID times, the unknown is super scary. But then with years of practice, I started pulling away from that and going a lot more into the psychology of it. It's always been, the psychology has always been with me, but now it's more and more and more. And I want to leave the practical part of it in a way of saying, okay, in May you're going to get married, on September you're going to I don't know, hit by a car. God knows. I mean, there are people who say these things.
I know. I have worked people through. I have helped people recover from the molestation, effectively, or the psychic intrusion of an astrologer saying that kind of thing to them. People who were told both their parents would die in the next year, who moved across the country, changed their whole life to be with their parents, and then their parents didn't die. Just extraordinary examples of what you're just saying. I mean, you could say it's joking, get hit by a car, but I mean, astrology gets close to that frequently with its concern about, Mars Pluto transits or Saturn transits or whatever they are, all the impending violence and disaster that might come. And of course, you could look through history and find some plane crashes or find some historical wars that did start under those signatures. It's not insignificant, but we have to realize there's 8 billion people on the planet. It doesn't apply in this literal way. It's part of a kind of complex symbolism embedded in the complex flow of the river of life. You can't extrapolate it in some literal sense and say all of the time under operational conditions, this will happen with this kind of signature. So I think you're describing as well a profound journey for yourself, aren't you? I mean, that's clearly a deepening, isn't it, that you're describing? You yourself have matured and deepened and connected with more of yourself during that process.
Hopefully, yeah. This is how I see it. This is how I feel it. I'm not so interested in the prognostic part of astrology anymore, even though, of course, everybody wants to know. But ideally, I would like to give people more of the psychological, symbolic part of it, so they can understand themselves better, and then this is how they'll understand what's coming next better. And
because that takes an important idea, doesn't it? That character is to a certain extent fate, that who you are inside determines your response to things. Because there's people who will hear this conversation, they'll think, well, we just don't do a good enough form of astrology, so the prognostication isn't good enough. And if we just did their form of astrology, we'd get it. And they see the psychological symbolic as a weakening.
Yeah.
I mean, I would dispute that predictive astrology ever gets things entirely right, or even right a huge percentage of the time, right? There's clearly some issues in it, which you could talk about. But the other thing is that the symbolic and psychic that you're talking about is not a lesser. When you point people back to the richness of their own psychic life and their own soul experience in a world that doesn't appear to value that, in a world that many people feel anxious and distressed and lost in because they feel disconnected from that part of themselves, that's a tremendous healing gift. That's a tangible. And I think astrology is one of the most nuanced tools in the world for that. Astrology is much better than the Myers-Briggs, or it's much better than almost any personality test or such like thing in the world. It's much more subtle and complex and layered and meaningful.
And at some points, even more straightforward
Yes.
with all that complexity and layers. When you see a chart, you pretty much can tell what's happening. But you should never escape the part where you talk to the person, where you ask them how they lived up until now, how do they feel, in order to know how this picture of theirs, the picture of the natal chart, has developed in their life and what they have done with it.
I mean, I think that's the key. The chart is not fossilized in eternity, is it?
Mm.
It's come about through a specific moment in space-time where a being came into being. And therefore the chart and its meaning is intrinsically linked to the arc of the life of that being. It's not separate. It can't be separated. There isn't an abstract, well, there kind of is a moon in Capricorn abstract in terms of like astrological cookbooks, but in reality, there is only all the different people with moon in Capricorn and their different subtle versions of that same archetypal principle. We have to be proponents of the archetypal understanding and then be prepared to get in the trenches with people and work out how the general picture applies in the unique case. And that requires an awful lot more empathy and compassion and listening and involvement for me, rather than staying within some abstract domain of prediction. It tends to bring out the worst of the magician complex in astrologers, that idea that I have studied ancient texts in my tower at the edge of town, yeah, and now in my long flowing robes I come to you with my wisdom. It's like that, isn't it, sometimes?
It is. And sometimes it's not like that, but people perceive you like that because I was with a group of people for New Year's, people that I don't know at all. And they, first of all, a lot of them were asking me when I was talking about their charts, they were asking me, is this for the moment or is this forever? Like, well, this is your natal chart, so it's forever, but it's not, because you can develop it, you grow into it. And the other thing is that I saw how petrified people are, that I know everything about them, which is also, I mean, I think it's very natural. Whenever somebody meets an astrologer or a psychologist, they're like, oh, now you know everything about it. Now, when I say something, you'll know something more than what I've already said.
Well, and it creates this psychic trap in astrology, doesn't it? Where astrologers are perceived like psychics, or guess my sign, or tell me this now. And it can reach an almost ludicrous level. I mean, it's rare, because I've got material out, like talking to you or books or talks or courses. People often come for readings with me knowing my approach, but not always. And a lady not so long ago, in the last year or two, maybe last year, was like, yeah, literally just specifics of her life that she thought I would know, down to whether she should live in this one house or the house that was 5 miles down the lane. I mean, as if the chart's giving you this kind of breakdown of linear decision-making information that in your life. I think it's understandable, but it's also, to me, a sign of the spiritual problem that I'm trying to point to. You see, people sense that there is a deeper life within them, but they also feel somewhat cut off from it and disinherited, because the culture and the society and the philosophy of the civilization doesn't support them in that inner life. So when someone comes along, and you might as well say astrologer, psychic, mentalist, magician, whatever, yeah, I read the ancient runes, oh, your gene keys, oh, human design, whatever it is, right? People have this hopeful sense, don't they? Like they might actually be connected to that deeper inner life, but then they're scared at the same time, almost like ashamed, because it's lived in slight darkness. That part of them has been pushed to the basement or up in the attic. They're not sure how it will be received.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about with one of my friends. She said people really, really want to be seen, and then they're so afraid to be seen at
Yes.
the same time.
Because in a world where you've had to hide some truth about yourself for so long, when it is seen, it has this tremendous power to liberate you. But it also, if it's seen by the kind of person or being that then shuts it down, as they see it, they're cruel towards it or shut it down or don't respond in a living way, that feels even worse because people have pushed that part of themselves into the basement for so long for a reason, to try and preserve it, to try and preserve the preciousness of their inner life. And that's everything that then gets stirred up when people have a sense to share that inner life. And I think that's one of the great gifts of astrology, that we could be involved with people rediscovering that inner life. If you think about that, it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, what a gift to feel a sense of reconnection with the most precious, the most magical, at its best, the most alive part of yourself.
You are such a poetic Pisces. As I mentioned, and this is again a very Piscean thing. When before we started recording, I mentioned that I didn't have an exact plan on what we are going to talk about, but I had a dream, and dreams are connected with Pisces. So I have the urge to talk about the nodes and the moon. And I think that the astrology that you practice with the evolutionary part of it is very much connected and based on that part of the chart.
Yes. Well, and there's so many different ways you could look at that. I mean, by the way, when we were talking earlier about some of the grim things that old astrology says, for an astrology, a lunar node class for Astrology University a few years ago, but they rerun it, that I did a breakdown of some Vedic analysis based on just one particular nodal position, and it literally gets to this point where it's not just, you know, you get killed in this particular way, it's for this particular reason. I'm sure parts of ancient history were pretty grim for lots of people, but still, that's a very extreme sort of stance. Yeah, I mean, I'm so interested in the nodes for a number of reasons. I mean, one, I think the conditioning environment is so important, right? The psychological milieu or context in which we grow up. The moon is of crucial importance to me as the symbol of the I, if you like, or the ego, or the conditioned self, or the personality, like how you were shaped by the country you grew up, the parents you had, the type of family home, the type of religious conditioning, etc., in a personal way. And people are going to say, Mark, the moon's not about religious conditioning. No, just anything that shaped you, moon, in your family, in the Saturn culture, the structure of the culture that you were born into. And so the interesting thing about the moon's nodes is they're formed together. So it's the orbit of the moon. So it's a related symbolism. It's you could look at the south node of the moon as some kind of idea of, you know, where the moon's coming from. And then you could look at that for very early childhood experience prior to the full embodiment of the conditioning. Or you could look to that, the kind of memories we bring in with us. And then with the north node of the moon, you have this arcing development, this upward movement where the personal self is looking to grow. So it's just this very simple dynamic tool for exploring personal evolution of the most personal part of you. And I love it for that, because it can cut through a lot. You can get very direct. You can see just the shape of the nodes in the chart can show you something that confirms the chart's overall shape, or it can occasionally run counter to the actual pattern you can see with your eyes, in which case it's trying to show you something about almost the person pulling back from that otherwise seemingly very strong pull. So I often, I mean, in my early days when I was developing this, I used to draw on charts. I mean, I used to draw lines across the nodes, and then, you know, planets squaring the nodes or things that were conjunct. I would circle them or draw the geometry of the nodal axis. So I'd be looking at a chart, then I'd print that chart off and look at it separately and draw all over it to show the flow of the moon's nodes. And I think it is that flow. right? People separate them all the time, but actually in reality, I don't think you can. How can you separate points that are fundamentally formed by the same motion? I mean, as I've shared with you on a number of occasions, in a way, my whole point with astrology is to increase soul, or is to increase psychic engagement or understanding of reality and the potentials in people's lives. And the moon's nodes are just a very simple way in. And I think much more simple than they're sometimes presented. They are like a flow of electric current that's animating the personal aspect of evolution.
You really make it sound as if it's really, really simple. Can you give us an example? Because the nodes are so interesting, and there has been said so much about them, and especially when you say this is your life's mission, when we're talking about the North Node, and when you say this is your soul, when we're talking about the moon.
Well,
And
no,
so
this is an aspect of your most personal experience when we're talking about the moon. And
on.
people do talk about the North Node like soul's purpose, and I'm not like totally against that or anything, but my problem, by the way, this illustrates one aspect of the power of the nodes for me, is that you can't separate them in that sense. You can't just say the North Node is like soul's purpose, because then what people do is they turn around and demonize the South Node and go, this is everything we need to get rid of, you know. I mean, this is just bizarre. This is like self-harming or something to me. They're literally like cutting yourself or something. It's that destructive, and people get very upset about it, and they make mistaken calls in their life about it.
Especially when it comes to people like me that have their South Node where their sun is. And the
Yes.
first time I read about it, and I was like, so I have to get rid of myself?
Yes.
How
Clearly. I mean, I think clearly straight away. I mean, you should be sent off somewhere. So maybe you should just live in a dark room or a dark cave. Yes, exactly. Punisher. Yeah. I mean, it's it's an absurdity, isn't it? It's just an absurdity. Also, I put it to you, right? This kind of thinking is based on the idea that there's some kind of past tendency that people have, South Node, and they need to develop this new future, right? I mean, I'm even somewhat okay with that, as long as you realize not to demonize the past. I mean, who do you know that completely transcends the past? You know, are you, as a human, are you even supposed to completely transcend your past? It's, it's almost pathological. It's traumatized people are the only people that try to completely eradicate the past story when it became unbearable, or people separate from their abusive family, or they try to shut down some area of their life. We act sometimes in our interpretation of the lunar nodes as if we're traumatized as a profession. The past. Oh, her son. Oh, turn down the light. Enter the darkness, and you will find your North Node. We're back to the magician, aren't we, with the long flowing robes and the kind of like fantasy film kind of stuff. To me, it's like an electrical current, or to me, it's like the dragon. The dragon's head and the dragon's tail. The dragon doesn't do well if you chop off its tail. Its ability to fly, for example, it won't be able to navigate or change direction or whatever. It won't be able to balance the wings. So the point is, both nodes need to be open, like a flow of meaning can occur between them. So if you take that classic case, like nodes in Aries, Libra, or South Node in the 7th, North Node in the 1st, people have literally broken down in readings with me, or been terribly upset. I need to be alone forever because I've got North Node in the 1st, South Node in the 7th. This kind of thinking, it makes no sense. Is Aries just about being alone and Libra is about being in relationships? No. And Aries people have relationships. I have friends who are Aries and colleagues who are Aries, and they have partners, some of them. It's just that the Aries person has this push towards the independence, and the Libra person has the push towards the relational nuance or even codependence. when you look at it psychologically, independence versus codependence, you realize there's a kind of midpoint, which is interdependence, relationality, where you maintain your independence, Aries, but you're still sensitive to the needs of other people, Libra. So that's the issue with Aries Libra nodes, or South Node 7th, 1st, etc. So when someone's, people are literally breaking down. I've had people literally just break down because they have to be alone. Like your feelings when you realized your son was on the South Node, like, get rid of yourself for the future. Or like it's Tarkovsky's Sacrifice. Remember that film where a man has to give up his own life, and not just that, memories of his own life, his own children, everyone, his loving family won't know he existed in order to prevent a nuclear war. Some weird psychic spiritual thought experiment as a film. I just think all of that sort of nonsense gets balanced when you realize both nodes need to be on. Both are a flow of meaning. So what you could say South Node and Sun, the person brings, or, had this very deep sense of themselves, or this light from the past. The ideal is that light then illuminates the context of the flow of the nodes. Okay. Is that different from Sun and the North Node? Sure. Does that mean sometimes the Sun might have to sit back and watch how things are, or shine its light across that process? Sure. But the idea that it's about getting rid of the Sun is simply, it's a split thinking. It's like a post-traumatic stress syndrome or something. What people do when they had such terrible pasts, they can't bear to be a whole person anymore.
Yeah, and it's not only the Sun; it's Mercury, it's Saturn. Everything is in Scorpio together with the South Node. So it means like half of my life I have to just put aside and see what happens.
Yeah.
Of course, this was the initial understanding and the initial start of me learning astrology, and I was basically reading Jan Spiller's book and crying over it.
Yes.
and and then I thought that maybe I should wait until I see how things go with me and my son. But what I do at the moment and what I tell people, because a lot of people really feel like they have to stay away from their South Node.
Yeah.
I think this is a very good standing ground from where you can use all the talents that you have from the South Node and then build up towards the North Node.
Oh yeah. I mean, undeniably. I mean, that's what it's designed for, effectively. It's designed to represent a flow of cumulative meaning, like the arc of life. Life is much more like an actual stream, isn't it? We're in something. You don't get to just go and sit on the bank for ages and abstractly study it. I mean, people would like that opportunity, or when we're learning astrology, sometimes it feels like that. Oh, I'm learning the rules of the river. But if you sit on the bank too long, the river just carries on. You get left behind, or you're in some abstract, self-conscious relationship to your own life. I mean, look, you read the Jan Spiller book. I mean, I haven't read that book, but I've looked at it. I mean, it's not awful, is it? Because you were engaged enough to read it. It has some soulfulness in it. At the same time, it's prone to that dualistic split thinking that so many books on the nodes are. I mean, just by treating the South Node and North Node separately, for starters. I mean, as if they're not implied by the other. As soon as you're saying South Node is whatever, Scorpio, you know that North Node is Taurus, right? Why aren't we fitting those things together? Why are we playing this game like they're in separate rooms or something? And I do think that's hurt a lot of people needlessly.
At the same time, I think it's a good starting point to understand or to realize or to see where your weaknesses might be.
Exactly.
And I think it's an important information, but it shouldn't be only that.
Well, and crying over your chart sometimes is not necessarily a mistake. I mean, it's part of its role as a tool in your life to accelerate your psychic growth and to see you contemplate different aspects of yourself or the challenges of reality.
Absolutely, yeah. And then how do you combine the meanings of or the purpose of the nodes together with the moon?
I mean, I've gone through different phases with this. I mean, I've looked at the nodes entirely separate from the moon, and then I've done workshops and ways of looking where I integrated the moon. Um, but I think, by the way, there could be more done with that. You know, I mean, what occurs to me right now is if you were going to say the south node of the moon is like origins of the moon or origins in your pre-verbal experience or what you brought with you, if you want to put it a different way, the moon is the specific conditioning or emotional psychic matrix of the current experience. And the north node is the balancing point, isn't it, to all of that, to give this sense of growth. You're almost better off seeing the north node as a balance point or like an electrical pole. You know, if there's too much positive in the past, it's a negative to give you the balance of the charge. Or if there's too much negative in the past, the positive that gives you the balance of the charge. It makes a lot more sense with all your planets on the south node to see it as that, like poles of charge. Let's say the south node's the negative pole, the north node is the positive, but the current runs along all of it.
Mm.
Without that, there's no circuit, there's no power. I mean, what, for heaven's sake, are you supposed to bring to your north node if it's not something that's come through you or been in your past or been deep within you? You've got nothing to take on the journey, as it were. The moon itself is, you know, the specific paradigm, because another idea that comes from this, by the way, is that because why aren't transits and various signatures in people's charts happening the way that astrologers would expect or would want them or like them to happen? Because the frank reality is, you know, we could say transiting Pluto to the sun, transiting Pluto to the north node, you know, Uranus opposite the sun, you know, Uranus to the ascendant or something. They're not small signatures, are they? And yet not everyone grasps their transformative potential. And I think a lot of that is to do with Saturn moon kind of dynamics, early conditioning imprints and the way they shape people, the moon, and the Saturn structure of society in which those conditioning imprints were laid down. And that's why both you and I have studied psychology and psychotherapy in different ways to such a high level, because I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, but, you know, both of us have realized that the developmental picture is so important and profound. It's so hard to transcend. You're not necessarily even living the other potentials, are you? Unless you've come out of the certain boxes that you fell into as you were growing up.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that one of the main things that happened to me when coming out of this conditioned astrology practice and going toward more and more towards the symbolic one, the psychological one, is um, when I had my Saturn transiting my Sun, and I don't remember anything bad happening. Actually, I remember things getting better and better since then. And then this was a recent one with Saturn and Pluto going over my moon. And whoever has seen my chart, I could see their fear on their faces. And thankfully, nothing bad happened then. Actually, it was, again, life was getting better and better. It wasn't
But
easy.
it's,
It wasn't.
yeah, but then life isn't easy, is it? And life, in a sense, wasn't designed to be easy. I mean, the single greatest thing about life is not that it's easy, is it? Because it saddens me to hear that, really. I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but it saddens me that astrologers see a fellow moon in Capricorn out there in the great, you know, crazy web of reality, trying to live their life, and they see an incoming Pluto Saturn transit, and they kind of, oh, well, I hope you make it through next year.
Dead.
Yeah, you know, say your prayers now. Yeah. Um, it saddens me. I just think we're failing as astrologers. There's a failure of imagination. There's a failure of psychic depth. the idea that Pluto or Saturn are just malefic entities, the idea that the symbol of maturation, in my viewpoint, and societal infrastructure, Saturn, psychic maturation and societal infrastructure, that symbolism is called malefic, is incredibly dangerous. I mean, we're practically celebrating immaturity. If astrology knocks Saturn, you're literally attacking the very symbol of psychic maturation. It's just not a good thing to do. And looked at from another perspective, the Pluto story is incredibly initiatory, isn't it? Frequently being dragged into the depths, or the events in the world that happened with that Pluto Saturn on your moon, corresponding with some fairly serious events in the world. They can be extraordinarily initiatory, can't they? It really depends on the person. So trying to warn people, that's the argument, isn't it, in this kind of analysis, that you were warned, that astrology helped you so you could plan ahead for the terrible disaster that would blight your life. I mean, really, come on. I mean, I'm not sure that's very satisfying, really.
But then don't we become the people from Oprah's show? Especially with that example of Saturn and Pluto going over my moon, and then I'm thinking, well, nobody died, thankfully. I'm fine as well. Nothing happened on a physical level. A lot has happened in a psychological level, of course, but nothing on physical level. And I'm thinking, well, if this has happened to me, it means that people might go over it again like me.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important, and I think it's far more common than people realize. People sometimes think, I mean, my moon in Capricorn is earlier than yours, I think, but I had that Pluto to moon a year or two before yours, and I moved house, I became a father. That was very challenging, by the way, to be an old dad, getting up at 3 a.m. with this little being who refused to sleep in any sane pattern to begin with. It was challenging, but the idea that that's horrible or something, I mean, it's just, it was my relationship with my daughter is one of the most profound relationships in my life. I mean, I wouldn't give that back up for the world. So the idea, it had a massive transformational effect on me. And my daughter's a sort of living Pluto transit, I guess. I mean, it's not exact on my moon Venus, but about her Pluto is about 3 degrees off my moon Venus. It's like, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with having this living being that transforms me my whole life and calls me out and sees me and is already taking the Mickey out of me, already does a routine about Marky and Jones, who likes wine and chocolate. Sometimes she calls me Posh Daddy. I don't know why. But she does this little routine. I've even found her on this chair with her big, fluffy dog thing. She set it up with glasses with my microphone. She's fascinated with what I do, trying to help people. The idea that something that changed me profoundly would just be a negative, even if it included very difficult changes, feeling too old for this, up in the middle of the night, having a few months with clients where I looked like a bit of a wreck. I remember this lady I worked with in Europe. So I was working with her in the mornings, seeing me about a year later and going, oh, you look so well. It's amazing. And I just passed it off a bit. I was like, oh, I think maybe it's a tan or something. The sun had been out. But then I remembered, she was working with me. She'd had a long gap before when I was like getting 3 hours sleep a night with a little kid, It's like, it was tough, but the idea that, and massively meaningful to me in all sorts of other ways, I don't know, it's just such a simplification, isn't it? That something that could be life-changing, including having challenges, would only be difficult or could only mean the end of everything. And then even if it was, right, let's say they were right? Let's say you just died that year in some hideous car pileup, right? Multiple pileup. How the actual F would it have helped you to know that?
That's another thing that the ethics are.
Well, and also just the agency, ethics aside, right? Moral concerns aside, which there are obviously many. just on the sense of agency, like what are we trying to do? We're not here to interpret reality for people. We're not here to save the world or be like the voice of prophecy or something. We're here to discuss people's next steps. When you do readings with people, you want to be discussing their next steps. You want to be discussing the sense of meaning that they're going to take from the conversation of the reading into their lives in a very intimate and dynamic way, hopefully. Doesn't produce any agency, does it, to look at incoming threats like they're some distant alien invasion who's destined to come here and doom planet Earth. It doesn't help us.
It doesn't help at all. But at the same time, it doesn't help to see the world in a linear way, because a lot of people are. I had a client recently and she was like, okay, well, now I'm confused. You said that at this point it will be good and then it will be bad. What do you mean? How come it's good and bad at the same time? Like, well,
welcome to life. Yeah. 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 The best and the worst are all bundled up together. Yeah.
So people get confused. They really expect things to be steady and one by one and organized in some way. And this really worries me because
I think it's concerning.
it is, yeah. And I don't know where they get the idea from.
Well, I wonder on a bigger picture level if, and obviously there's people in the world that would just laugh at this, but in relatively speaking, the West, in Europe and North America and Australasia, we haven't become so, largely for decades, there hasn't been, inland invasion. North America's never had an actual land invasion. That people, that we've developed a mindset out of the relative success in some parts of the world. It seems like a terrible irony to say this, and blessings to the many people in the world who are still caught up in active warfare. Blessings to you. But the relative success of peace in the West post the Second World War for long periods of time has produced people who've to some extent forgotten how bad things would get, and yet the psychic displacement of events like that, and we look at the world today and we have this network now of communication, we see it all much more radically, much more closely. Massive events happened in the Second World War and people saw distant news reports weeks or months later that had been heavily edited. You have this September 11 attacks, or you have recent events, they're so publicized. People could literally, if they, it's, what's that term, doom scrolling. You can literally just go into Google and just spend hours absorbing the sheer torrent of horrendous suffering and man's, inhumanity to man, as it were. And it's created this very complex situation where we actually have very peaceful lives, often, many of us, where people aren't used to certain direct involvement with things. And yet psychically, we're burdened with this visual torrent that pulls on the heartstrings, that sees people leak psychic energy, that their empathy for their fellow human through, intensely high resolution visual imagery. Someone can just have a GoPro camera and it's better quality than movies that were being made in the 50s or something. And it's like we're lost in it all sometimes. We're lost in the technological advancements have far outstripped the ability to psychically digest.
And then I think maybe because all of my Scorpio planets, but I think it brings reality, because sometimes I think we forget that we are not alone in our happy place or in our struggles that are a day-to-day struggle. And I think that it balances out the reality.
Say what you mean more by not alone. It seems important.
Like sometimes people forget that they are not the only person in the world, or their little community or family or friends or whatever they're doing with their everyday life. Um, and they get angry for stupid reasons sometimes, even though of course we cannot say that whenever somebody's feeling emotional. Of course, as a psychotherapist, you cannot say that somebody's feelings are stupid, but um, I think that the scale of problems is balanced by understanding that there are bigger problems that are.
Yes. Yes. There's two ways this can go, of course.
Yeah,
Some
of course.
people hide, some people it causes extra shame. They're trying to open up about their personal, say,
Oh,
childhood
definitely.
hurt. Yeah. And then they go, oh, but it wasn't as bad as the terrible suffering in the world. And I'm like, hey, let's just park the terrible suffering in the world for a moment and listen to your actual personal reality. But yes, the other way you're saying it is very important. Clearly, we're caught up in trivial concerns far too often from a psychic, from a soul standpoint. They are just trivial. Exactly how our day's going to go. Did I make the right decision getting an Android phone when I had iPhone for years,
That's what I
etc.?
mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. The stuff that goes on in your house, some kind. Oh, duh, I just cleaned the driveway, and now all the leaves have fallen down again. Yeah, leaves fall off trees, don't they? I'm surrounded by trees here. There's a lot of leaf clearing, but and we're back to the Saturn lesson, aren't we? We're back to two things, it seems to me. The Saturn lesson, that which is like the soldier aspect of reality in some ways. You've got to get up and do it. You've got to get up and show up for your child, show up for work, clean your house, clear the leaves that keep falling from the many trees, whatever it is. You've got to just accept there's a certain amount you're going to have to show up and do. And then it's the loss of the bigger picture, isn't it? We have been trained really for survival reasons to use our minds to narrow our focus to gain specific functions all the time. The next meal, the wood for fire, the evolutionary gain mentality, everything around me. What's it? How am I going to hunt it? How am I going to do that? And we get stressed in this kind of like, I have to understand this micro thing and achieve. And there's no then like, what and that's where astrology is so beautiful, isn't it? The starry sky. You look back, you lean back one evening and suddenly it's there, the sky shining at you. I mean, that's what prompted people to study the planets. That's the whole astrological impulse in a nutshell, to have that bigger picture moment, to come out of the hunter-gatherer mindset, the survival mindset, and just participate again in this bigger picture.
And maybe again, coming back to the nodes and that balance that you were on about, with the south node being our everyday life and the north node being the struggle, but also the expansion and the balance that brings us, so that we are aware of both sides of
But,
the node.
well, and that the south node is something that was already patterned in you, and that the north node is an emergent point that would balance or harmonize that. Because you could argue all astrology is polarity, really. I mean, look at the setup of the archetypes. They're all in a relationship like that. In a sense, it's not a goal, like it distresses me. I know they're supposed to be amusing, but even just on like social media, things like, oh, the best signs to date if you're a such and such,
Tell me
it's
about it.
it's depressing, isn't it? Because it's such an obvious simplification on the one hand, but also because it fails to recognize the power and meaning of polarity. That the goal in astrology is not to just achieve. Again, it's the same mindset, like the survival mindset or the competitive mindset or the achieve in society mindset, isn't it? I'm going to become the best, I'm going to have the victory. There isn't a victory in astrology. I mean, you're going to grow old and die, and no one escapes that, right? There is no victory, or the victory is only being as whole and as filled with heart and wisdom and insight and participation in reality as possible, fulfilling the full extent of your unfoldment. And the idea that another person, no matter how many flowing robes they wear and no matter how many astrology books they've studied in their great tower on the edge of the city, the idea that they can know what that fully is, the idea that any astrologer out there, no matter how famous or how impressive, can know what your unique soul unfoldment would actually be. I mean, just think about the arrogance of that for a moment. That you could take the place of someone's soul or the divine or that which is special within them.
Yeah, and it just people as if they don't understand how complex a person is. Even the people that are asking for a soulmate or for the perfect combination of sun sign, Venus sign for their chart, they really fail to understand how deep a human being is and how complex.
Exactly. Well, that's what the failure is. The failure is a failure to understand both life and the individual, and therefore astrology, because in a sense, astrology is genuinely complex, right? It's difficult to learn, right? Difficult-ish. I mean, it's not advanced math, it's not rocket science, but at the same time, it's quite difficult, right? But the complexity of astrology is as nothing compared to the complexity of life or the complexity of a human. That it's an attempt to make a symbolism that's more accurate because it's more complex and nuanced. But it's not as complex and nuanced as life itself, because that would be impossible. And we have to bear that in mind all the time. For me, that makes me more humble, more dedicated to listening to the meaning of the gaps between my conceptual framework and reality, or the reality of another person. Not trying to color it in by doubling down on astrology. Too many astrologers faced with the prevailing insecurity of how complex life is just shout with their placard, about what astrology is and can do. Oh, this could do these amazing things for you, help you with the complexity of life. It kind of can, but not by ignoring that complexity, not by falsely simplifying it.
Mm. Yes, I couldn't agree more. Even though maybe we sound a little bit arrogant.
Well, that's my I mean,
our knowledge and people not understanding the complexity.
Well, it's just but also maybe it's the antidote to problems in other areas. It's not like science doesn't have these problems, is it? There's an arrogance in science sometimes, or
Yeah.
Western medicine has made tremendous breakthroughs, but it still doesn't understand how the ancient traditional Chinese medicine, acupuncture and herbal medicine work, and yet they're still valuable to people. What are your plans or goals for 2024?
I don't have many, to be honest.
What would you be trying to do with your astrology or your psychology?
Well, hopefully, I'm going to do more teaching because I love teaching. And I'm teaching astrology. I'm teaching tarot even at the moment. And
Great.
yeah, that's what I aim for. Also, something that didn't really work out last year, but hopefully it will work out this year is a psychology, astrology book retreat of some sort in the mountains. So that's what I'm hoping for as well. How about you? Oh, and
Sounds very cool.
I can't wait to meet you in March.
Yes, we're going to meet in person, aren't we?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. I think that retreat sounds amazing. Yes, I have that speaking gig in March, with a series of astrologers, the Jupiter Uranus teaching that I spoke about already, an in-person retreat at the end of April, looking at the 12 signs as a kind of healing journey, as a kind of, like the sun through the seasons, effectively being the psychic life of the soul. Yeah. So I'm really excited about that. I'm also working on a deeper background on a course about, in a way, resacralizing, or putting the sacred back into the symbolism of astrology from the beginning, and examining the 12 signs as taking that idea of the psychic life of the soul and making it even bigger, and examining all the basics of astrology from that reimagined perspective. So that's the bigger course going on in the background. And then if that wasn't enough already, I will relaunch another live version of the psychosynthesis training, slightly modified, but live version. So using pre-recorded teaching materials from the original psychosynthesis coaching training I did during 2021-22, with my colleague doing live mentoring supervision groups, and then us all coming together in the latter parts of the course and just hanging out. So just like you, really trying to continue to imagine how astrology and psychology blend in the most dynamic and useful way for people. And I feel buoyed up by that, if I'm honest. I feel inspired by the goal of directing all of this towards psychological growth, healing. And I really think it can be done. This isn't an extra. It's not like Mark was a strange magician and he got interested in astrology, and then he discovered that there was counseling or therapy, and he thought, oh, it'd be nicer for people if we just put a bit of that in. It's not like that. It's all in it from the beginning. It's all because what I'm most interested in is psychological and spiritual growth. What I'm most interested in is humans achieving their full potential, and participating in the most loving and inspired way with all of life. Astrology is just a tool in a way. It's a symbolic system that might, at its best, take us closer to that.
I'm at the moment working in my head towards how to explain why astrology and psychology can work together, because I had a question. I had a couple of times this year I was asked, isn't astrology like a diagnostic tool? So if you are diagnosing somebody, how can you cure them? You cannot do both. So I cannot diagnose you with something and then be the cure for your something, because psychology and psychotherapy might be it shouldn't be so framed.
Well,
And
that's a very interesting conundrum, isn't it? I'm not sure I entirely agree, but then I'm not sure that I think that astrology is a diagnostic tool, not in that clinical sense. But by the way, there's a very interesting conversation. Maybe later in the year, we can have that conversation, because immediately a series of thoughts spring to mind. Because you see, and we come back to the art point, the structure of the natal chart is more like a poem. It's more like an interpretive potential, right? With inherent meaning. I'm not just saying every interpretation is as valid as any other, right? I'm not making a simple, excessive postmodern point, right? I don't agree with that. I mean, there is actual inherent meaning. At the same time, it's not one that you can respond to without the interface of the person. Astrology can't be a diagnostic tool because the chart is an abstract symbolism. You need the person, don't you? And you could argue even too much clinical work uses too much abstract symbolism. People are just filling in a 30 question questionnaire, and then based on the score at the end, they have clinical such and such. I'm not even sure that's particularly effective. But I'd love to come back to those subtle points with you maybe sometime later in the year.
Definitely we should do that, because I think, again, depth is what's lacking this argument. It's not just a tool. It's not just, okay, this is what you're diagnosed with. Go and sort yourself out.
Yes.
The layers and the depth and the symbolism and the soul in it all is what is actually astrology and psychology into one.
I couldn't agree more. It's been a pleasure to see you again so early in the year. An inspirational conversation. Yes. I'm super excited about you've got to do the retreat in the mountains, haven't you? I mean, that's just too cool to not do.
I really hope it works out this time, because I think it's super cool, and everybody nowadays, or at least around me, is buying books but not reading the books. So the book retreat should happen at some point. And yeah, I can't wait to see you live in London. I love London. It's just my love. So exciting times ahead. Thank you very much for meeting me.
Oh,
And
my pleasure. And just to say to people, that event in London, it's at the Royal Albert Hall, in the Elgar rooms at the Royal Albert Hall, and there'll be
very posh.
four astrologers. I know. As soon as I saw it be in the Royal Albert Hall, I thought, how can I pass down an opportunity to go into the
Me
Royal Albert
too, me
Hall? I
too.
know. Yeah. So look out for that. That's at March 23rd, and it's
Hmm.
a really
29th,
interesting 29th,
30th, 30th.
something like that. I
Yeah,
thought it was the 23rd. We'll
March.
check the date.
I, I think I fly on the 29th and the event is on the 30th.
Yes, you're right. It's on the 30th in the Elgar room at the Albert Hall, a series of astrologers talking about astrology as a charitable event, a great thing to support, organized by Frank Clifford of the London School of Astrology. I'm really looking forward to it and looking forward to meeting you there. Have a great rest of the year until then. Good luck with all your projects.
Thank you. You too. And speak soon.
Yeah, all the best.